Hello, and welcome to this week's sermon. Things are going to be a little bit different this week. This is going to be a sermon for the 19th of May 2024, which is Pentecost Sunday, and in our Methodist tradition is also Wesley Sunday. And my theme for this Sunday will be the ministry of Charles Wesley. And I'm going to tell a story first. Those of you that look at our sister YouTube channel, St. Paul's Methodist Church Remuera, in order to view the full service on a Sunday, will know that I tell a little story as part of the liturgy every week, as well as preach a sermon. And on this occasion, I'm going to tell the story and then preach the sermon to give you double measure, as it were, of Charles Wesley. So here's the story. On Friday the 22nd of July 1743, Charles Wesley made his first visit to Cornwall. After a wet day of travel, he arrived at the brand new Methodist chapel in St. Ives. In 1741, the very first Methodist chapel had been opened in Bristol, the New Rooms. But within a few years, Methodist chapels were beginning to spring up all over the country. Charles took off his coat and entered the pulpit. He announced his text, Isaiah 40, comfort ye, my people. Whereupon a band of violent-looking, angry men burst in. They shouted at members of the congregation to get out immediately, or they would be killed. The mob of ruffians then set about the pews, the collection box, the windows and shutters, and demolished the insides of the building around their ears. They swore at Charles, saying he must never dare preach there again. Charles replied that Christ had died for them all. This did not pacify them, but increased their rage. Several times they raised their clubs to beat Charles about the head, but each time they restrained themselves at the last moment. God had stayed their hand, according to Charles. They then set about the women, pulling at them in order to expel them from the chapel. One elderly woman was particularly roughly handled. The leader of the mob was the mayor's son. Charles told him to act like a gentleman and unhand the woman. Hit me, he said. I'm not a woman. Whereupon the mayor's son switched sides and began to help Charles calm the situation. Charles told the congregation to stand fast while the mob raged about them, smashing up the new chapel. After about an hour of this, yes, a full hour of mayhem and destruction. After an hour of this, their fury was spent. The mob began to quarrel among themselves, and then they left. Exactly 3 months later, in October 1743, Charles was at Nottingham when his brother John arrived, bruised and blooded, after enduring the largest and most violent riot ever to befall the Wesley brothers. Charles heard how they had tried to kill John in the town of Wednesbury, and how many of their blows had missed his head because he was so short of stature, and had gone over his head and smacked their fellow rioter in the face instead. He had been rescued by a rugby-tackling butcher who saved him from being caught by one ruffian. John escaped with a torn coat and a bloody nose. Knowing this, Charles returned to Wednesbury the very next week. Fearlessly, he organised a service for the Methodists, and he describes how they sang their hymns that day. We sang praises lustily and with good cheer, he confides in his diary. Charles is often overshadowed by his older brother, but he too played his part in the founding of Methodism. He showed the same grit and determination in the face of opposition. He too travelled extensively, even if not to the extent of his brother John, But Charles did his share, and without him, we wouldn't be here today in the Methodist Church. And now for my sermon for Wesley Day. This is, as I say, the 19th of May 2024. In August 1741, Charles wrote in his journal, "I discoursed on the healing at the pool of Bethesda for nearly 2 hours. The whole congregation were in tears." I hope to do Charles justice here today. My aim is to tell you something about Charles Wesley that you did not already know. I hope I can manage that. I've chosen this theme because it tells us of events over Pentecost weekend in 1738, a momentous weekend and few days following that changed the lives of John and Charles Wesley. Firstly, I wish to look at the complex relationship Charles had with his more famous elder brother, John. We all know that John was plucked as a brand from the burning when Epworth Rectory was set on fire. But we forget that Charles was also rescued that night from the fire. In fact, we often overlook that the 14-month-old Charles was there at all. But perhaps Charles was also destined for great things, like his mother assumed of his elder brother's escape from the inferno. When Charles was a schoolboy, he refused to accept a considerable inheritance from a relative in Ireland because he thought the money, quote, would make him too worldly. The money went instead to an Irish relative, who later became Lord Mornington, and whose grandson was Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington. I take 2 points from this. Firstly, never underestimate the capacity of children for serious religious faith. Secondly, had Charles accepted that money, our capital city might well have been called Wesley rather than Wellington, or we might now all be speaking French. It was when John was absent from Oxford, working at as his father's curate in Root near Epworth, that Charles founded the Holy Club, the first Methodists. When John returned to Oxford, John quickly took over the leadership. So often, Charles was the first to make a move, only for his elder brother to follow him and then take over. This was particularly true in the early days of the Methodist revival. It was Charles who was recruited by General Oglethorpe to go to the new colony, Georgia. But John decided he wanted to go as well, and so joined the trip. It was Charles also who was the first to leave Georgia for home. Oglethorpe turned against Charles as they sailed across the Atlantic, and even gave away Charles's bed to another settler. This may have prompted Charles to walk through the colony 4 times a day from early morning, banging a huge drum to call people to worship. This did not endear him to either Oglethorpe or the settlers. It was Charles who first met the Moravian Peter Burler in London, whose advice to preach faith until you have it helped keep both Charles and John in the ministry after their unhappy time in America. It was also Charles who had his mystical conversion experience before his more illustrious brother felt his heart strangely warmed. We keep Wesley Day on the 24th of May to commemorate John's conversion experience. But on the morning of the 21st of May, 1738, Charles had his conversion experience. Charles was ill at the time, and from his bed thought he heard a Mrs. Musgrave say to him, "Arise and believe," and thou shalt be healed of all thy infirmities. But Mrs. Musgrave was not at his house and had not visited that day. The voice was actually that of his housekeeper, Mrs. Turner, who had had a strange dream on the Friday evening, that's the 19th of May, when Charles had first been struck with illness. She had dreamt that she had been woken during the night by loud banging on the door. She got up, opened the door, and there was a man dressed in white. "Who are you?" she had asked. "Jesus Christ," replied the stranger, and then gave her this message to relay to Charles. All day Saturday she had been too disturbed by the dream to mention it, but early on Sunday morning, Pentecost Sunday that year of 1738, she had confided in her brother, who had urged her to pass the message on that she had received in the dream. Hence her call up the stairs to Charles on his sickbed: "Arise and believe, and thou shalt be healed of all thy infirmities." Charles wrestled with the meaning of this premonition throughout Sunday and Monday, but early on Tuesday, the 23rd of May, Charles woke up, recovered in both body and spirit, and wrote his conversion hymn, "Where shall my wandering soul begin?" We all know what happened to John later the next day. Charles never did understand why Mrs. Turner's voice had sounded like Mrs. Musgrave's. I believe it was simply a mistake Charles made in his delirious condition, or perhaps a little mystery God intended that would help him believe it was a true message from Christ and not just a fancy taken hold of by Mrs. Turner. Who knows? What I deduce from this is that we are all called to serve the Lord without looking for thanks and recognition. Without Charles's leading in those early years, there would have been no Methodism. Charles is easily lost in the shadow of his elder brother, who in most things followed Charles's lead and then took over. But ironically, should Methodism ever cease to be, and the name of John Wesley fade into history, for as long as Christians exist anywhere in the world, people will know of Charles and sing his hymns. A supporting role is easily overlooked and overshadowed by the more glamorous, but at the end of the day, nearly every one of us is called to play a supporting role to someone. Few of us will go down in the history books, but nonetheless, God couldn't manage without us. And let us remember that Methodism itself was first raised by God to play a supporting role alongside the Church of England. I believe there is a Methodist way of doing Christianity, which can be lived out not just within a Methodist church, but in a whole variety of church traditions. I believe this fervently from my ecumenical encounters over the years and my time in Rome. If we take Methodism as a particular form of spirituality, rather than simply as a particular church denomination, it can sow new seed in many other pastures we have not yet touched. Methodism can play a supporting role across much of the world church. Methodism should not be confined to or restrained by the Methodist Church. This brings me to Charles's attitude to separation from the Church of England and sacraments and ministry. There were two main battles fought and won by John and Charles over the first 5 years following their conversions in 1738. The first was against predestination, and the second against stillness. So thorough were their victories that we do not even recognize the words today. Stillness was the doctrine becoming popular through both the Quakers and the Moravians that declared church ministrations such as Holy Communion, baptism, public worship, and so on, were unhelpful before the individual was inwardly converted by the Holy Spirit, and afterwards were unnecessary and merely a matter of choice. Thus, the stillness doctrine. Before inner renewal, the Church's ministrations were of no help, and after inner renewal, they were of no purpose. Both Charles and John were fervently in favour of the worship life of the Church, especially its sacramental life. Charles kept the octave of Easter, for example, celebrating or receiving communion every day of the week after Easter Sunday, and he earnestly followed his brother's teaching on constant communion. Charles was very keen to avoid doing anything that looked as if they were joining the Moravians. Hence his strong insistence on cleaving to the Anglican Church. From 1756, however, the threat of separation loomed ever larger, and Charles famously urged Methodists to continue in the old ship. But after being barred by his fellow Anglicans from preaching in their pulpits and receiving from their altars, his cause to maintain Methodism within the Church of England was doomed. Charles's instinct was to stay within the Anglican fold and renew it from within as a new form of spirituality. But this proved untenable when the Anglicans made it plain that they did not want him or his brother and their fervent followers anywhere near their churches. It is not the stillness of the Moravians that threatens Methodism today. It is the stillness of apathy and secularization. We have too many Methodists who act like the Church is an added extra to their faith, which they can easily do without. So let us today be on our guard against those who make out that the life and ministrations of the Church, its worship, sacraments and ministry, are superfluous. Methodism will choke itself to death if it retreats into clubs of private piety, but also pour itself to oblivion if it sees social justice alone as the mission of Methodism, or simply tear itself apart if secular politics and culture wars are allowed to dominate our agenda. Whilst Methodism starts with the inner warmed heart and expresses itself in social justice, Methodism also needs the nourishment of praise and worship and Christian fellowship. Methodism was born in song. It shall certainly die if ever it stops singing. The other major battle Charles fought alongside his brother John was the fight against predestination. This idea took hold in many circles throughout the 17th to 18th centuries. It was the belief that God had preordained those who would respond to the gospel and go to heaven, and those who would not. We could debate the merits and origins of such a belief, but that is not the point. The point is that such a doctrine leads to a sort of apathetic fatalism. It takes the wind out of every evangelistic sail to believe that those God has earmarked for salvation will inevitably come to faith somehow in God's good time, and if they are earmarked for the other place, then why waste your time and energy? Methodism was all about sharing and spreading the gospel. It wanted to shake off the dead hand of predestination. Such theological fatalism was a mere coping mechanism, a coping mechanism to respond to the growing secularization of the Age of Enlightenment. If the Church was failing, they could say it wasn't their fault, but that God had predestined it to be so. Wesley would not go quietly into the has-beens of history. For him, the gospel was alive and relevant to everybody, as it always had been. So, despite his distaste for the practice, a distaste even stronger than that of his brother John, Charles soon eventually took up outdoor preaching to the crowds. He had resisted for months after John had submitted to become more vile. That's John's way of talking about open-air preaching. But one day, George Whitefield failed to turn up, leaving Charles having to fill the breach and address the expectant crowd. Charles's life changed dramatically after his marriage to Sally Gwynn. After 16 years of itinerant preaching, facing riots and mobs like his brother John, Charles settled down to family life with his family in Bristol, although he could still be absent for months at a time on his preaching tours. Upon marriage, Charles had to agree to stay in bed until 6 a.m. rather than get up at his usual 4 a.m. He also had to agree to get undressed to go to bed. Well, a busy man hasn't got time for that sort of nonsense, but Sally was not slow to lay down the law. But apparently, Charles did stand firm as a vegetarian. He had preached to the crowds, over 10,000 strong like his brother, but began to feel his main contribution was in writing the hymns that taught the Methodists their faith. Charles wrote over 5,000 hymns in his life, many of which we still sing around the world today, even if the Americans don't sing them to the proper tunes. So, whilst very few of us today will ever read a single sermon of John Wesley, the church today, and well beyond Methodism, will sing Charles's hymns. So it could be argued that little brother, that lived in his big brother's shadow for so long, is actually having a greater effect on the life of Christians today than his elder brother. Certainly, Charles Wesley is a safe ecumenical space where Christians of many denominations can gather. This is my meaning in saying Methodism can be viewed not just as a family of churches within the Protestant fold, but as a form of spirituality which may be adapted to grow in many ecclesial soils. On the 8th of September 1748 in Dublin, Charles wrote in his journal, "The Presbyterians say I am a Presbyterian, the Church of England that I am one of theirs, and Catholics that I am a good Catholic in my heart." I suspect if Charles were with us today, he would ask for nothing more. Amen.